The bustling Chicago International Airport was alive with the usual chaos. Rolling suitcases thumped across polished floors, loudspeaker announcements echoed through the halls, and travelers hurried to their gates with coffee cups in hand. In the middle of this swirl stood Keanu Reeves, quietly unassuming, dressed in a worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. He waited patiently in the first-class line, his old canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. There was no entourage, no flashing cameras, no outward sign that this was one of the most recognizable actors in the world. A few feet behind him, a man named Eric Maddox shifted impatiently, tapping his shiny designer shoes on the marble floor. Eric, in his late 30s, was sharp-suited, hair gelled and dripping with an attitude that craved attention. Eric worked in real estate. Big deals, big talk, big ego. And when his eyes landed on Keanu, he saw only a scruffy man who, by his judgment, had no place in the first-class line. First class? Eric muttered loudly, more to himself but just enough for Keanu to hear. Guess they're letting anyone up here these days. Keanu turned slightly, offering the faintest polite smile. No bite, no reaction. That only emboldened Eric. As they moved through security and toward boarding, Eric continued with his whispered jabs, chuckling under his breath, shaking his head, whispering to his phone about some drifter in first class. Keanu, for his part, remained silent. He was used to people underestimating him, judging by appearances. Years of fame had taught him patience, but Eric was just getting warmed up. Once aboard the plane, Eric's smirk widened as he checked his seat, 2A, only to see that the drifter he'd been mocking was sitting in 2B right next to him. "You've got to be kidding me," Eric muttered, loud enough for Keanu to hear. Keanu gave a small nod, quietly settling into his seat, by the window. Eric flopped down beside him, dramatically pulling out his noise-canceling headphones, phone, and tablet. "Well, this should be interesting," he muttered with a grin. The flight attendant approached, offering drinks. Eric waved her over quickly. "Champagne, please. Make sure it's cold," he said, flashing a toothy smile. Keanu quietly requested, "Water." Eric let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Water in first class? Man, you're missing out." Keanu simply sipped his drink, gazing calmly out the window. Passengers filed into the cabin, and the bustle died down as seatbelts clicked and the engines rumbled to life. Eric leaned over slightly, the smell of expensive cologne filling the narrow space. "So, what do you do, man?" Eric asked, his tone laced with condescension. Keanu turned, his eyes kind but steady. "I work in film." Eric's eyebrows shot up. "Film, huh? Like indie stuff, background roles?" He smirked. "Or maybe you're one of those guys who says they're an actor, but, you know." Keanu offered a small, amused nod, then turned, back to his window. Eric shook his head, chuckling to himself. "Hey, don't take it personally. Not everyone's cut out for the big leagues." The engines roared, and the plane lifted smoothly into the sky. What Eric didn't know, and then what the other passengers were beginning to notice, was that he was making a fool of himself on the national stage. Because the man sitting quietly by the window wasn't just another passenger. He was Keanu Reeves. And very soon Eric Maddox was about to regret every single word he'd spoken. The plane cruised steadily over the clouds, the hum of the engines filling the cabin with a soft vibration. Eric Maddox leaned back in his first-class seat, tossing his jacket over the armrest and stretching like he owned the space. Every so often he threw a glance at the man beside him. Still puzzled, still smirking. "You know," Eric began casually, turning toward Keanu, "I've been working in real estate for over 15 years, closed some of the biggest commercial deals in the Midwest." He smiled proudly. "It's a tough game. Not something you survive by being quiet, you know." Keanu offered a polite nod. "Sounds demanding." Eric leaned in slightly, his voice lowering into a patronizing tone. "What about you? You said you're in film. Like, what do you actually do?" Keanu took a slow sip of his water, his calm presence unwavering. "Acting, mostly." Eric let out a soft laugh. "No kidding? And you're flying first class off that?" His eyes sparkled with mock surprise. "Man, good for you." Keanu gave no reaction, just a quiet half-smile. The truth was, the cabin around them was shifting. A woman across the aisle, middle-aged, elegantly dressed, had recognized Keanu within minutes of boarding. She watched the interaction closely, eyes narrowing at Eric's condescending tone. A young couple 2 rows back had already pulled out their phones, whispering to each other as they scrolled through photos. Eric, oblivious, kept going. "You ever think about doing something bigger?" he asked. "Like something that really pays off? Not knocking your hustle, man, but, commercials or small movies only get you so far." Keanu finally turned his head, meeting Eric's gaze directly. His expression was patient, steady, but there was a flicker of quiet amusement in his eyes. "You're probably right," Keanu said softly. Eric smirked, leaning back like he'd scored a point. "Hey, no shame in it. We all play to our level. Bye." Now whispers had spread down the first-class cabin. The woman across the aisle leaned over to the man next to her. Is that Keanu Reeves?" she murmured. The man squinted, then nodded slightly. Eric was too busy feeling victorious to notice. Eric continued, adjusting his watch. "When I was in LA last year, I met a bunch of actors at this industry party. None of them were flying. First class. Honestly, you might be the first I've ever seen up here. So congrats, man. Must have been a good month for you." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his gaze gentle. "Thank you," he said calmly. Across the cabin, the whispers had turned to quiet murmurs, small heads turning, passengers glancing over the tops of seats, and subtle smiles appearing on faces. Eric leaned in again, grinning smugly. "Hey, maybe you'll get your big break one day." Keanu gave a faint smile, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe." It was at that exact moment the flight attendant returned, carrying a bottle of water. She stopped at their row, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, her voice laced with respect. "The captain wanted me to let you know. He's a huge fan of your work. He sends his regards." Eric's smile froze. "Also," the flight attendant added, "would you like me to deliver the fan letters that came to the gate? Or would you prefer to receive them after landing?" Eric slowly turned his head, eyes wide, face draining of color. Keanu gave a small, gracious nod. "After landing is fine, thank you." The attendant smiled warmly and moved on. Eric's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His fingers twitched as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. The truth had just landed, and the weight of it hit harder than any turbulence. The man he had been mocking wasn't some background actor, some struggling extra, or a lucky upgrade. He was Keanu Reeves. And Eric Maddox realized in one brutal instant that he had been humiliating himself in front of the entire first-class cabin. Eric Maddox sat frozen in his seat, his mind scrambling to process what had just happened. Keanu Reeves? He stole a glance at the calm man beside him, the same man he'd been mocking for the last hour, now knowing exactly who he was. His stomach dropped. Keanu sat quietly, eyes on the window, a peaceful smile resting on his face as if nothing had happened. Not a single ounce of arrogance, no triumph, no smirk, just stillness. Eric felt his pulse quicken. Passengers around them were no longer pretending not to notice. The woman across the aisle smiled softly in Keanu's direction. The young couple 2 rows back nudged each other excitedly. Phones subtly lifted to snap a picture. Even the flight attendants carried themselves with a little extra grace, their glances toward Keanu respectful and warm. Eric sank deeper into his seat, suddenly hyper-aware of the hush falling over the cabin. His fingers fidgeted on his armrest. Trying to recover, he cleared his throat and gave a forced laugh. "Man, I had no idea. I mean, you didn't say you were Keanu Reeves." His voice cracked slightly, the confident edge gone. Keanu turned to him, his expression gentle. "You didn't ask." Eric winced. "Yeah, I guess I didn't." For the first time in the entire flight, Eric realized how loud his own voice had been. How sharp his words must have sounded. How small they felt now. He shifted awkwardly. "Look, man, no hard feelings, right? I was just messing around, joking. I mean, we're all just people up here, right? He gave a weak laugh. Hoping to brush it off, Keanu studied him for a quiet moment, then gave the faintest nod. We're all just people. That line struck Eric harder than he expected, because beneath the words, there was no spite, no revenge, no need to rub it, just honesty. The irony wrapped tightly around Eric's chest. Here he was, a man who spent his life climbing ladders, proving himself, flexing status, and the most respected person on the plane was the one who didn't need to prove anything. Eric's mind flashed through every mocking comment he'd made earlier. Guess they let anyone in first class. Maybe one day you'll get your big break. His throat tightened with embarrassment. The seatbelt sign dinged above as turbulence nudged the plane gently. Passengers settled back, murmurs quieting down. But Eric couldn't settle. His heart pounded, his cheeks flushed, his hands restless. Flight attendant came by, offering fresh drinks. She beamed at Keanu, pouring him a fresh glass of water. Eric declined awkwardly, waving her off with a tight-lipped smile. He tried to focus on the in-flight movie, but nothing held. Instead, his thoughts swirled. Why had he been so quick to judge? What did it say about him? That he needed to measure others to feel superior? That he missed the obvious humility sitting right beside him? Keanu shifted slightly, pulling out a small book from his backpack. Eric glanced at the cover. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Of course. Eric let out a slow breath, closing his eyes for a moment. He felt something unfamiliar stirring inside. Not just embarrassment, but reflection. For the first time in years, maybe longer, Eric Maddox wondered if he had been living his life the wrong way. Because today, on a flight from Chicago to Los Angeles, he had learned a brutal, unforgettable lesson. The loudest man in the room is often the one with the least to prove and the quietest. Sometimes, he's the legend everyone else wishes they were. The plane glided smoothly across the sky, the city lights far below fading as the cabin dimmed for the evening. Eric Maddox sat stiffly in his seat, his earlier swagger completely drained. He stared at the back of the seat in front of him, arms crossed tight, leg bouncing nervously. Beside him, Keanu Reeves quietly flipped the pages of his book, completely at ease. His face was calm, eyes relaxed, every movement slow and deliberate. Eric sneaked another glance. It still didn't seem real. Keanu Reeves. Right here. A man he had insulted for over an hour, mocked for his clothes, his simplicity, his presence. Eric ran a hand down his face, cheeks burning. He could feel the change. In the air. Passengers still whispered now and then. Flight attendants stopped by with soft smiles, and every so often someone walked past to the bathroom just to sneak a glance. But Keanu didn't bask in it. He didn't feed on the attention, didn't shift or perform or flash status. He just was. Eric tried to tell himself it wasn't a big deal, that it didn't matter, that maybe he'd laugh about this later. But the truth sat heavy on his chest. He'd spent years building his image. Fast cars, fancy watches, perfect suits. A constant need to prove he belonged in rooms like this. And yet here was a man who needed none of it, and still commanded more quiet respect than Eric had ever felt in his life. He swallowed hard, the back of his throat dry. He wanted to apologize. But how? How do you apologize after making a fool of yourself in front of the most respected man on the plane? Eric took a shaky breath, tapping his fingers nervously. Hey, Keanu? Keanu turned slightly, eyebrows raised. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, Eric mumbled. For earlier. For being a jerk. Keanu held his gaze for a long, still moment. Then with a soft smile, he simply said, It's okay. 2 simple words. Eric let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And then Keanu added, We all have moments we're not proud of. The words landed hard. Eric nodded slowly. Yeah, we do. He looked down at his hands, ashamed at how tightly he was clenching his fists. The cabin around them grew quieter as passengers dozed off, reading lights dimming one by one. The hum of the engine softened into the background. Eric sat there, eyes on the window, watching. The darkness outside. He thought about his job, the deals, the competition, the endless chase for more. For the first time, it felt hollow. Keanu's words echoed softly in his mind. We all have moments we're not proud of. For the rest of the flight, Eric sat in silence. Not from shame, but from reflection. Maybe this wasn't just a humiliating encounter. Maybe it was his chance to change. The hours passed quietly as the plane glided through the night sky, the glow of city lights far below. Eric Maddox sat in his first-class seat, still, thoughtful, his earlier arrogance drained away. He had never felt so small and yet so strangely clear-headed. Beside him, Keanu Reeves sat calmly, occasionally sipping water or glancing at his book, completely unbothered. Eric peeked sideways, his chest tightening again. He thought about speaking, but the words stuck. What could he even say? Sorry I acted like a jerk. Sorry I judged you before I even knew you. It all felt too thin, too weak. The flight attendants passed through quietly, and Eric noticed how they addressed Keanu, not with fanfare but with quiet respect, a kind of warmth that didn't need loud admiration. It hit Eric harder than anything. Here was a man who had nothing to prove, and still everyone knew his worth. Eric thought about his own life, the constant selling, pitching, proving, boasting, real estate deals, expensive watches, flashy dinners, the endless climb to be seen as someone, and yet next to him sat a man who had mastered something Eric hadn't even learned to touch. Stillness. Suddenly, Keanu turned slightly. You okay? He asked softly. Eric blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, I just been thinking. Keanu gave a small smile. Good time for that. Eric let out a small laugh, the tension breaking just a little. Yeah, I guess it is. He hesitated, then quietly added, I've spent so much time trying to prove I deserve to sit in seats like this, trying to look successful. Keanu tilted his head, listening. I don't think I've ever just sat still, Eric admitted, his voice low, without trying to impress anyone. Keanu nodded slowly. It's not easy. Eric gave a tight, almost embarrassed smile. Yeah, I can tell. For the first time on the flight, they sat together in a comfortable silence. Not forced, not awkward. Just two people side by side, stripped of all the noise. Eric could feel something inside starting to shift. Not in a dramatic Hollywood moment kind of way, but in the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, he'd been living the wrong story. And maybe, sitting next to Keanu Reeves on a midnight flight was the first time he'd truly understood that. The plane began its slow descent, the captain's voice crackling softly over the intercom, announcing the final approach. Passengers stirred awake. Window shades lifted, seat belts clicked into place. Eric Maddox sat quietly, heart pounding, not from nerves but from the strange, humbling weight of the past few hours. Beside him, Keanu Reeves calmly tucked away his book, adjusted his seat belt, and smiled faintly as the landing lights flickered on. Eric cleared his throat, fidgeting. He knew he had one last chance before the flight ended, before Keanu disappeared back into the crowd of the world, leaving only this rare encounter behind. Hey, Eric said softly, voice tight. Can I ask you something? Keanu turned slightly, waiting. Eric took a deep breath. How do you do it? How do you stay so calm, so grounded? I mean, with who you are, what you've done, the fame, the attention. Keanu's eyes softened. He gave a quiet smile. I remind myself, Keanu said slowly, that all of that can disappear in a heartbeat. Fame, money, attention. It's just noise. Eric listened, leaning in. Keanu continued, his voice steady. What matters is who you are when no one's watching. How you treat people when they can't offer you anything. How you live when no one's keeping score. The words hit Eric like a slow wave, sinking deeper than any lecture or self-help book ever had. For a long moment he sat frozen, letting it settle. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, the cabin shaking lightly as the plane sped along the runway. Eric exhaled slowly, staring at his hands. As the plane taxied to the gate, the cabin filled with the usual shuffle. Passengers standing, luggage being pulled down, hushed voices returning. Keanu rose smoothly, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. Before stepping away, he turned back to Eric one last time. "Take care of yourself, Eric," Keanu said gently. "And remember, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." Eric felt a tightness in his throat, nodding faintly. "Thanks, man, really." With a small, respectful nod, Keanu disappeared down the aisle, greeted quietly by a few polite passengers, never pausing to draw attention, never needing to. Eric sat for a few more seconds, heart pounding in his chest, a strange mix of humility, shame, and always surprisingly, hope. He finally stood, grabbed his briefcase, and followed the line of passengers out into the bright, bustling airport. As he stepped onto the jetway, Eric knew one thing for sure. This flight wasn't just a trip. It was a wake-up call, and maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a version of himself he'd never dared to imagine. The version that didn't need to prove anything, because the only thing that mattered was the man he chose to be. And that was a truth even Eric Maddox couldn't deny anymore.